and welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. On Wednesday, the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv issued a rare, urgent warning that Russia might launch a, quote, significant air attack. The embassy was closed and employees were told to shelter in place. Officials did not say if there was any specific information about the threats to the building, and the air raids were sounding for most of the country due to incoming drones coming in from Russia. Apparently, they had been thwarted by missile defense with debris falling on a residential building in Kyiv. But it was the first time that U.S. Embassy employees had been told to shelter in place in recent memory. The warnings just came days after the Biden administration gave permission to Ukraine to use U.S. long-range missiles, specifically Army tactical missile systems, or ATACMs, to attack inside Russia. This is the latest in a string of crossed red lines for the administration. And according to our guest today, a big one. Ukraine has taken its new authority and is running hard with it, launching at least 6 ATACMs into Russia on Monday, hitting an ammunition facility in the Bryansk region in the southwestern part of the country. According to the New York Times, quote, the strike represented a demonstration of force for Ukraine as it tries to show Western allies that providing more powerful and sophisticated weapons will pay off by degrading Russia's combat capabilities and relieving pressure on Kyiv's overstretched forces, end quote. But my colleague, Mark Episcopos, a research fellow in the Eurasia program at the Quincy Institute and a scholar of Russian history and military strategy, says this is folly, that allowing Ukraine to strike deep into Russia not only prolongs the war, which he believes will never ultimately turn in Kyiv's favor, but opens up NATO countries to attack, even nuclear attack. To put a finer point on it, the Kremlin updated its nuclear doctrine this week, declaring attacks on nuclear powers fair game if Russia is attacked with their weapons via a non-nuclear power like Ukraine. So Mark is here to walk us through his thinking on this. Thank you, Mark, for joining us on Trip the Beltway Fantastic.
Thank you. Pleasure to be on.
Great. I'm pleasure to have you on. Mark, you noted in your Responsible Statecraft story this week that this is one more example of U.S. officials, quote, Trump-proofing their Ukraine war policy, that the White House decision to greenlight Ukrainian ATACMs strikes within Russian territory, quote, shows just how far the Biden administration is willing to go to handcuff President-elect Donald Trump to its Ukraine policy, end quote. Can you talk a little bit about the timing of this new authority that Biden has given Zelensky in Ukraine?
Well, look, the timing is inescapable, where you do have a presidential transition. We're about 60 days out from a new president taking office who has promised to pursue a very different course on Ukraine to bring the war to a negotiated settlement. And in this period, where I might add, Biden now is a lame duck, Republicans have a trifecta in Congress, Senate, and the presidency. Biden pursues this major, in my view, injudicious, tactically senseless escalation that can only be perceived as an attempt to make it more difficult for Trump to make good on his mandate and pursue exactly the kind of negotiated end to this war that he promised. So it's not only tactically senseless, and certainly none of the battlefield realities that led the Biden administration to hold off on giving this green light have shifted. None of the realities on the battlefield have shifted, except to the extent that the Ukrainians are now losing even faster, and Ukraine is now in a worse battlefield position than ever before. But what has changed are these political dynamics, where the Biden administration is doing everything it can to make its policy sticky, to make it more difficult for Trump to pursue a different course. And now this creates all sorts of issues for Trump, because the Biden administration gave this green light. The Trump administration can theoretically revoke permission for Ukraine to use ATACMs within the Russian exterior. But that would create all sorts of friction between the Trump administration and Ukraine at a time when Washington and Kyiv need to be on the same page about how to go forward with negotiations with the Russians. And if the Ukrainians are allowed to continue using these weapons, that, on the other hand, can create all kinds of difficulties in the negotiations itself, where the Russians clearly perceive this as a hostile step. And we have to understand, I mean, just to lay it out for your audience, these weapons are not simply fired by Ukraine and then, Ukrainians press a button and off they go. These weapons are guided. The coordinates, the tracking, the targeting, all of that is done by U.S. technicians, by U.S. specialists. And so now we have that kind of very deep, in my view, unsettling engagement by America in this war that clearly detracts from the Trump administration's goal to bring this war to a negotiated end, and doesn't make Ukraine any better off, doesn't leave the Ukrainians in a stronger battlefield position. So it's strategically pointless. It's tactically even worse. And the political timing, I think, does raise serious concerns.
Let me ask you about the strategic element here. I've been reading for months, if not years, that Ukraine needed this ability. And if they got it, that could turn the tide of the war. So, what do you say to all of those voices in Washington who have been begging the Biden administration for this authority, with the idea that Kyiv can turn things around with the ability to strike Russia deep inside the country?
Well, I would refer those voices to the Biden administration itself, to John Kirby, who explained in recent weeks and recent months that there aren't enough of these weapons, that they can't make a decisive battlefield difference in the sense that we would interpret it as. Certainly, Ukraine would be able to strike certain Russian infrastructure sites, command and control, logistics, supply chains, all of that. But the Russians have had months to redeploy critical assets away from range of Ukrainian ATACMs. And the Russians have had months to bolster their air defenses in ways that would make the ATACMs potentially less effective. And we heard yesterday that there was already Ukrainians have struck Kursk using ATACMs. And according to the Russians, 5 out of 6 ATACMs were intercepted successfully. Now, we don't know if this is true. This could be an exaggeration, but nevertheless, these ATACMs missiles are operating in Kursk under operationally very difficult circumstances, and their effectiveness has been severely dampened. And so the Biden administration has correctly diagnosed all of these problems. And if we add to that the scarcity issue, where we have very few of these missiles, and every ATACMS used in Kursk is one less ATACMS that Ukraine can use in Donetsk, in eastern Ukraine, where the Russians are rapidly advancing. All of this creates a situation where these missiles, as the administration itself admitted, apparently according to the New York Times, cannot decisively tip the war in Ukraine's favor, or even decisively give the Ukrainians a clear strategic boon in a way that would allow them to have some kind of momentum entering negotiations. So this is a manpower war. It's an artillery war. And by artillery, I don't mean ATACMs. I mean munitions of the kind, shells that are fired in the millions every month and produced in the millions by the Russians. The ATACMs cannot fundamentally cure the ails of which afflicting the Ukrainian war effort. And it does speak to a kind of strategic short-sightedness, where the goal all along has been to show resolve, to show the West, the Biden, U.S. allies, that the U.S. is engaged in helping Ukraine, that we are doing something. But that is not adding up to a policy that will help Ukrainians achieve victory on the battlefield. And all of that was acknowledged and cited as very compelling reasons not to provide Ukraine with ATACMs, which makes this recent volte-face by the administration even more puzzling and more concerning.
Okay, Mark. Well, I have to ask you then, how is Russia going to respond to what is clearly an escalatory move on the part of Biden and Zelensky and Europe?
Well, Kelly, the Russians are presented with a powerful incentive not to escalate in a way that would jeopardize upcoming peace talks. And, for the Russians to forcefully retaliate against the United States or against NATO directly now at this point would almost be to punish Trump for something Biden did because of this transition period that we are now in. So I would. It's always difficult to make predictions in this business, but I would say I don't see the Russians climbing the nuclear escalation ladder in response to this beyond the kind of symbolic gesturing that we saw with the updated nuclear doctrine and sort of flexing our muscles and telling NATO that we can go down this road if you want to, but we would rather not. That being said, there's plenty that the Russians can do and have been doing asymmetrically to impose costs on the West for its incrementally deepening involvement in Ukraine. This can include arming the Houthi rebels. It can include deepening this North Korea-Russia defense relationship that the West is very uncomfortable with, and I might add our South Korean allies. It can include arming the Iranians. There are reports of Iran receiving S-400 missile systems, which of course the Russians have not done. They have not supplied Iran with these advanced capabilities up to this point because of the Russia-Israel relationship and Putin's very delicate balancing act in the Middle East. But Russia can escalate asymmetrically in different theaters. And I fully expect to see that continue, and I fully expect to see that ramped up. And of course, Russia also enjoys escalation dominance inside Ukraine itself, the Ukrainian theater. And so there's plenty that Russia can do to ramp up its bombing campaign inside Ukraine to target.
Which it seems like it already is doing that if you look at the last 24 hours or so.
Evacuation of the embassy in Kyiv apparently now. And so we're seeing that kind of, the Russians can absolutely do much more to apply pressure on Ukraine in the winter in a context where Ukrainian infrastructure is already crumbling and Ukraine is facing tremendous challenges with energy supplies and shoring up its crumbling home front and its crumbling front lines. So despite the fact that Russia has powerful incentives not to escalate directly, there are still plenty of ways to impose a series of smaller costs on the West that can add up when viewed in totality. And if you look at, why exactly are we doing this as considering all of these costs, considering all of these risks, I really don't have a good answer. The ATACMs do not leave Ukraine better off strategically or even tactically, perhaps operationally in a very marginal sense. But those minor operational benefits are, in my view, far outweighed by the military risks, by the political risks, and by the deleterious effects that they can have on upcoming peace talks, which the Russians have an interest in at least hearing what the Trump administration has to offer. And I think it's in our interests to seriously explore ways of winding down this ruinous 3-year war. And the ATACMs decision does not bring us closer to these strategic aims. It's a strategically myopic decision, in that sense, a kind of a dying last gasp of what has been, unfortunately, a failed approach by the Biden administration. And Ukraine has borne the brunt of these failures over the past 3 years.
I mean, we don't know a lot about what the Trump administration foreign policy is going to look like, but one of the things that we do know is that, like you said, Trump wants to end the war. He wants to bring this conflict to the bargaining table, including both sides. He's talked not extensively, but he's been consistent that he wants to end the war almost immediately when he takes office. What does this do when Biden gives this authority and brings the conflict to a whole new level, as you're describing, what does this leave for Trump to deal with on day one?
Well, it sends a very alarming signal to the Russians, and the ball is now in their court. And we've talked about how the Russians can possibly respond, and we're hoping that it doesn't rise to the level of a response that could jeopardize these crucial peace talks in January, February, going into the spring. But it does leave Trump with a much more difficult situation, and one can't help but wonder if that was the goal all along. If the goal was to handcuff the Trump administration to this kind of failed, ineffective approach. And we're also seeing, of course, a green light for contractors, for U.S. military contractors to operate on Ukraine on some kind of a reduced or limited basis. And we're seeing a surge in aid. With every other day, we're seeing hundreds of millions of dollars announced for Ukraine. And all of that in totality doesn't leave the Trump administration in a better position to negotiate an end to this war. It only creates further headaches for Trump to deal with. And the big headache is, does the Trump administration revoke the decision to greenlight ATACM strikes inside the Russian interior? Because if they do, then that will create all kinds of difficulties with the Ukrainians, who now have this capability and are very interested in using it as much as possible. But if they don't, this could be perceived as a hostile or unfriendly step by the Russians. So if the goal is to tie Trump's hands or to make it more difficult for the incoming administration to seriously apply themselves to their campaign promise to resolve this war, then I suppose mission accomplished. But I don't see why that should be the goal. I think this is fundamentally not in American interests. It doesn't serve the cause of stability and peace in Europe. It certainly doesn't benefit Eastern Europe's flank to have this conflict continue for now the third year and potentially boil over into neighboring regions. The Poles, the Lithuanians, the Latvians, the Estonians are at an increased risk because of all of this. And so I see tremendous disincentives on the part of the United States to continue this kind of policy of escalation that has not led to anything that we would recognize as an end to this war on terms that would benefit Ukraine and the West. And that, to me, should be the fundamental goal. And it's not, unfortunately, what we've seen for the past 3 years, but now is the time to turn a new page. We do have an administration that seems determined to pursue a fundamentally different course. And despite this decision, and perhaps other decisions we could see down the line in the coming weeks, I think the Trump administration is fundamentally in a solid position to at least seriously enter serious dialogue with the Russians and have, if not a meeting of minds, then at least some kind of a modus vivendi over what a stable architecture of European security and what peace in Ukraine can look like. I think it's a noble goal. I think it's a necessary goal. And it's a goal to which I hope the administration fully applies itself in its honeymoon period, when it does have a very strong mandate to pursue precisely the cause of peace. And I hope it succeeds.
Yeah, and I just wanted to know this morning, and we're recording this on Wednesday, it was announced that the Biden administration has approved the use of American-made anti-personnel mines in Ukraine as ostensibly as a way to slow down Russian advances on the battlefield in Ukraine. I find this highly ironic because Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, was making these remarks about the anti-personnel mines and taking questions from reporters from Laos, which is still dealing with their landmine issue some 50-something years after the Vietnam War. He insists that these are non-persistent landmines that are more safer than the old kind. There's a lot of debate about that. But the idea, Mark, that we're allowing them to use additional types of weapons, particularly these, despite what Lloyd Austin might say about the lingering danger of these particular mines, they will linger long after we hope there'll be a resolution to this war at the bargaining table. So it's almost like they're sabotaging the talks, because say there is an agreement within a year, and you got all these mines you got to clean up afterwards. this just seems like that they're literally laying bombs, literally laying mines for the next administration.
Well, if we were to proceed from the premise that the Biden administration is doing everything it can to make it as difficult as possible for the incoming administration to end this war, what could this administration do any differently? What more could it do? It seems like they're doing everything precisely in this direction. And it seems to me a policy that first is devastating to Ukraine because of these long-term consequences, but also in the short to medium term, Ukraine is not just losing this war, but it's losing this war decisively. And we shouldn't put a date on it. We shouldn't predict a specific day. But Ukraine is certainly on a trajectory of collapse. Time is not on our side. The situation on the front lines is very difficult, as even President Zelensky himself and people around him increasingly explicitly acknowledge. And no amount of surging military aid, no amount of ATACMs, which we have a very short supply of, can possibly do anything to alter this fundamental reality. And it's as Churchill said, America will do the right thing after it's tried everything else. I do hope that we will eventually do the right thing. And that is the only thing that we could have done all along, and that is to explore some path to what a negotiated settlement will look like. Now, we have to warn people, and we have to be upfront that this will be a difficult process. We should not expect Ukraine to walk in and sign an agreement with Russia, and that'll be the end of it. There will be back and forth. And to your point about Vietnam, we could be looking at a model where even as peace talks are ongoing, we still see a continuation of fighting along the front lines. But peace talks, especially in a war that's gone on this long and has been as devastating as it is, peace talks are always difficult and complicated. But we have to finally wrap our head around the fact that there is no viable alternative. This war cannot end in any other way but in some kind of a settlement. And there are all sorts of thorny issues about the territorial question, about what form will Ukrainian neutrality take, about will the Russians insist on certain limits on Ukrainian weapon systems in pursuit of their aim to demilitarize Ukraine, quote unquote. But all of those things will have to be sussed out as part of the negotiations.
I'm going to have you back on the show to talk about all that stuff too.
It's going to be a difficult process, but it's a necessary one.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you, Mark. I really appreciate your time and your insights and your expertise. And I know listeners do too. So I genuinely mean that. I want you to come back on the show and talk to us as a new administration takes over in Washington, and we can see what that means, what kind of impact it will have on the Ukraine war policy.
Delighted to be on and always happy to be back.
Thank you, Mark.